yourself. Everyone else is already taken. Have you heard this phrase before? It's quite the uplifting sentiment. Well, it's actually from a man named Oscar Wilde, who was a poet and playwright in the 19th century. He chose to be himself even when it did not paint him in the best light. You've probably heard of at least some of his works, the most popular being the play The Importance of Being Earnest. And you probably know vaguely of him as this aesthetic playwright that was popular in England in the 1900s. While these sentiments are accurate, they do not tell the full story of who Oscar Wilde was, or why, to put it frankly, we don't have as many works from him as we have from other authors or legends. You probably don't know about the controversy with his illegal and then highly criticized actions of homosexuality and gross indecency with male persons, his sentence served in prison, or how he died in negative opinion with the public. This is the untold story of Oscar Wilde. Like every other popular artist or legend, Oscar Wilde had a dream to write for the sake of beauty and to gain recognition for it, or even just a livable wage. Like with most artists, this did not happen overnight, but we do know that those with a passion do not burn out so easily. Oscar Wilde began writing and publishing works in 1880 when he was just 26. He mostly wrote poetry in magazines, one full-length play called Vera or the Nihilists, and later essays and dialogues. But nothing was quite popular enough to generate notoriety. He took on his first novel in 1890 called The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was immediately criticized for its allusions to homosexuality. Critics ran it through the mud, calling it effeminate, nauseous, and contaminating for its homoeroticism, even though the main romance in the story is a heterosexual relationship. He then turned back to theater, writing a play called Salome, but it was refused of a license because it depicted biblical characters. Despite these hardships getting his plays and writings off the ground, he continued on. One of Wilde's first comedies, called Lady Windermere's Fan, gained popularity in the first year that it toured in 1892. Despite some criticisms from conservatives, it still toured the country for months and gained Wilde his first large revenue. His success only grew from there with his writing of A Woman of No Importance and An Ideal Husband. Finally, he was getting recognized as a serious playwright and noted for his philosophy in art and aesthetics. He could leave his past criticisms behind him and continue to grow as a playwright. He couldn't have known then that he was going to be a legend, but when his plays first took on the West End, I'm sure he felt some semblance of it. What could dampen his popularity now? On February 18, 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry left a calling card for Oscar Wilde at his private club, saying, "Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." Sodomite, or sodomy, is what was referred to as homosexual relations back in the day. At this time, homosexuality was a crime and was seen as heinous to the public. So this could really dampen Oscar Wilde's just starting reputation and career. Why did the Marquis write this accusatory card to Oscar Wilde? It wasn't that he had a particular hatred for his writing and this was some form of nonsensical hate mail, but it was his son, Lord Alfred Douglas, and his relationship with the author that spurred this claim. Lord Alfred Douglas was a poet, a writer, and an editor for a journal called The Spirit Lamp. In this journal, he wrote about some of Wilde's works, and his writing overall carried a homoerotic subtext, which caused strife between himself and his father. In 1891, Douglas met Wilde, and they began a secret affair. Wilde provided Douglas with many material items and affections, but he remained mostly reserved in public, in contrast to Douglas's wild, pun intended, side. Douglas had connections to the underground gay communities in England at this time and introduced Wilde to male prostitutes. With Douglas's reckless nature of his relationship with Wilde and the previous tensions with his father over his writing in his journal, John Sholto Douglas, the Marquis of Queensberry, took to writing letters to try to dispel the relationship, antagonizing Oscar Wilde and expressing his anger with his son. This is the letter that Queensberry wrote to his son, Lord Alfred Douglas, on April 1st, 1894. Alfred, your intimacy with this man Wilde must either cease or I will disown you and stop all money supplies. I am not going to try and analyze this intimacy, and I make no charge, but to my mind, to pose as a thing is as to be as bad as it. With my own eyes, I saw you in the most loathsome and disgusting relationship as expressed by your manner and expression. Never in my experience have I seen such a sight as that in your horrible features. No wonder people are talking as they are. Also, I now hear on good authority, but this may be false, that his wife is petitioning to divorce him for sodomy and other crimes. Is this true, or do you not know of it? If I thought the actual thing was true and it became public property, I should be quite justified in shooting him on sight. Your disgusted, so-called father, Queensberry. There was a lot of fire behind that letter. Queensberry did not only express his obvious distaste for this relationship, but he even threatened Oscar Wilde to his son. At this time, Oscar Wilde did have a family, a wife, and 2 sons. Douglas, the young rebel that he was, wrote back to his father in a telegram, simply saying, "What a funny little man you are." I mean, he ate him up, honestly. What a funny little man you are. It's so direct and also so calm with just like the right amount of I don't give a damn. What a funny little man you are. I might steal that. Obviously, he was not getting through to his son, so he took to threatening Oscar Wilde with the card Oscar Wilde posing sodomite, to not only threaten him, but to also threaten his reputation, which was just peaking in popularity with the opening of 2 of his plays, The Importance of Being Earnest and An Ideal Husband, opening on the West End. Wilde did not take this lightly and took Queensberry to court for defamation. It was against his friend's advice, who told him to be more quiet about it, but he was going to stand up for himself. Even when it did thrust this public claim of sodomy into the public eye, when he himself and his friends knew of his actions that could be considered sodomy. However, Wilde moved on with the trial. His friends tried to encourage him to flee the country, but Oscar Wilde stood his ground. Maybe that was his way of choosing to be himself, choosing to own up for who he was and what he had done. But Wilde should have listened to his friends. To not be convicted of defamation, Queensberry took to hiring private detectives in order to investigate Wilde. Remember those underground communities of gay prostitution I mentioned earlier? Well, that did not help Wilde's case. Many of the men in the underground could account Wilde's presence, were interviewed, and were even taken as witnesses to the court. There were also letters sent by Wilde to Douglas, love letters, that were taken as evidence. Wilde claimed that these were just sonnets sent to Douglas for his critique as a writer. But as all of this evidence came bearing down on Wilde, and further proving the Marquis of Queensberry's claim, Wilde dropped the prosecution, leaving Queensberry found not guilty, and Wilde had to pay off the trial and Queensberry. But by this time, many of Wilde's crimes had been thrust into the spotlight. He was soon after arrested and taken to trial for gross indecency with male persons. Queensberry left a note to Wilde at the end of the first trial that read, "If the country allows you to leave, all better for the country. But if you take my son with you, I will follow you wherever you go and shoot you." Oscar Wilde was tried on April 26, 1895. He faced 25 accounts of gross indecency with young men who he had relations with as witnesses. There were even housekeepers from the hotels Wilde would stay at that came forth stating their account of the young men he would take there and how they left the bedsheets a mess. Throughout the trial, Wilde continued to deny all allegations of indecent behavior. Witness after witness, evidence after evidence. Was he a liar? Refusing all of these accounts of his actions as if he did not do them? Was he hoping his reputation and charm would outweigh his crimes? Or was he refusing the idea that his homosexuality was criminal and indecent? While we know in modern times that homosexuality is becoming less criminalized and ostracized around the world, it is still not universally accepted, and much less so in the 19th century. Was Wilde a protester? An advocate for the gay community with his publicity? With his refusal that his actions were criminal and indecent? Was this his way of protesting the laws put in place at this time? Or was he just a victim of his time period, feeling like he was indecent for his actions and his desires, yet he still committed them because it was something that he wanted. It was something fast and pleasurable that he just did for fun. After all, he did say that the danger was half the excitement. At the end of the second trial, the jury debated for hours and did not come to a conclusion. But only 3 weeks later, Wilde would enter his third and final trial. The trial had become too politicized at this point. It was in the public eye as Wilde's name was taken off ads for the St. James Theatre, where The Importance of Being Earnest was still playing on the West End. Wilde was questioned on the letters that he continued to send to Lord Alfred Douglas throughout these trials. Every phrase with romantic language that he wrote was brought forth as evidence. Lines from Wilde's own prose writing was meant to incriminate him. After 3 hours of deliberation from the jury, there was a final verdict. Mr. Justice Wills considered this case the worst case he has ever tried, as he pronounced Wilde guilty on all accounts of gross indecency with male persons. He sentenced him to 2 years in prison and hard labor, which at this time was the maximum sentence possible. Accounts reported that Wilde turned gray, swaying on his feet as the jury shouted bouts of hatred at Wilde and agreed with the sentence that was given. Wilde tried to yell over the shouts, "And may I say nothing, my lord," but was drowned out by the cries of shame from around the courtroom. We will never know what Wilde wanted to say in response to the sentence given. For what it's worth, he did not grow violent or shout back in anger. He simply asked if he could speak, perhaps to defend himself. Despite if Wilde's denials of his indecency were a form of protest in favor of the gay community, the trials of Oscar Wilde proved detrimental to the public's view of homosexuality. Backlash of homosexuality became harsher. Art and effeminacy was seen as a direct correlation to homosexuality. Relationships, romantic or not, of people of the same sex became strained, fearful, and distant. The gay communities grew anxious and were further hidden and ostracized. Prison was not easy on Oscar Wilde, and an injury to his ear would bring about an infection not treated properly. But he never stopped writing. From prison, he wrote a poem called The Ballad of Reading Jail. Reading Jail was the prison where he was incarcerated. A certain stanza has become popularized because it has been speculated to reference Wilde's own experience with homosexuality, and particularly his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas. It reads, "Yet each man kills the thing he loves, but each let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word." Wilde could be referring to the way he charmed many young men with his own flattering words, only to kill his own desire for a relationship with fast pleasure, prostitution. Wilde also took to writing a letter to Douglas that ended up being over 50,000 words, a word count that classifies as a novel. In it, he apologized and forgave Douglas for all that had happened, admitting to getting caught up in the unfulfilling pleasures of life. Douglas denied ever receiving this letter. Can you imagine? Writing 50,000 words as a way of apologizing to someone that you loved and them denying if they ever even received it. Maybe he did receive it. Maybe he did or did not read it. Maybe he was ashamed still. Did not want to be associated with Oscar Wilde. Of course, this is all just speculation, but it's pretty sad. Wilde was released from prison on May 19th, 1897, and immediately fled to France. France, at this time, did not have any laws against homosexuality. He was broke and depressed, having been essentially exiled from his country, his family, and his own success. That August, Douglas did meet with Wilde, despite backlash from both of their families. And they lived together in Naples for a few short months before they separated due to the poverty. Wilde could only stay in a dingy hotel at this point and told his publisher he had lost his joy of writing. He developed meningitis from the infection that he suffered in jail. In October of 1900, he wrote to his friend Robbie Ross saying only, "Terribly weak, please come." On November 30th, 1900, Oscar Wilde died of meningitis at the age of 46, with only his friend Ross by his side. Just 20 years later, 1920, Oscar Wilde was second only to Shakespeare as the most widely read author in all of Europe. In 2011, his grave was cleaned of many lipstick marks and a glass barrier was installed, which to this day is constantly covered again with lipstick marks and love letters. There's like a little heart there, that's cute. In 2017, Oscar Wilde was among 50,000 men publicly pardoned for homosexual acts no longer considered criminal by the British Parliament. Many legends die in glory and fame and remembrance. Oscar Wilde died with a tainted name and a lipstick-smeared grave. But even so, he still chose to be himself. After all, everyone else was taken.